On the 23rd of May 1618, an event occurred in Prague that altered the fate of Europe for the next 3 decades. In the assembly hall of the Bohemian Chancellery, enraged Protestant nobles gathered. They had come to the imperial regents with accusations of violations of religious freedom. The air was tense to the limit. Catholic officials Jaroslav Martinic and Vilém Slavata refused to acknowledge the rights of Protestants to build their own churches. The argument escalated into a fierce confrontation, and then what went down in history as the Second Defenestration of Prague occurred. Count Thurn and other leaders of the rebels seized both regents, along with their secretary, Philip Fabricius, and threw them out of a window. The height was about 20 meters. Catholic sources later claimed that the Virgin Mary saved all 3. They fell into a pile of manure and survived. The Protestants, however, mocked them, saying that they were saved only by the soft contents of the moat beneath the castle windows. Regardless of the reasons for their miraculous survival, this act became an open challenge to imperial authority. Bohemia had lived by the principles of religious tolerance for many years. 2 centuries before these events, Jan Hus had preached reformist ideas there, for which he was burned at the stake. His followers, the Hussites, defended their right to their own faith in the bloody wars of the 15th century. Later, when the Reformation of Martin Luther began, Protestantism found fertile soil in Bohemia. The Letter of Majesty of Rudolf II in 1609 guaranteed Protestants freedom of worship. The new emperor Matthias and his heir, Archduke Ferdinand of Styria, adhered to a rigid Catholic line. But behind the religious slogans lay other interests. Bohemia controlled vital trade routes between the Baltic and the Adriatic. Its silver mines in the Ore Mountains and the legendary Kutna Hora brought huge revenues to the crown. Prague's textile production and glass manufactories flourished. Czech merchants traded throughout Europe. The Habsburgs did not just want to return the heretics to the bosom of the Church. They sought to establish complete control over the economy of the wealthiest kingdom. Protestant nobles resisted not only for the sake of faith, but also to defend their trade privileges, land holdings, and the right to manage revenue from the mines. Ferdinand was educated by Jesuits and considered it his duty to eradicate heresy in all lands under his rule. He had already demonstrated his resolve in Styria, where Protestants were forcibly converted to Catholicism or expelled. Now, the same fate threatened Bohemia. The Protestant nobles understood that if they did not rise up now, their rights would be trampled upon forever. After the defenestration, the rebels formed a provisional government of 30 directors and began to assemble an army. Bohemia effectively declared independence from the Habsburgs. News of the Prague uprising spread quickly throughout the Holy Roman Empire. Protestant princes watched the development of events with trepidation. The Catholic camp, led by Pope Paul V and the Spanish King Philip III, prepared for decisive action. The German lands were a patchwork quilt of hundreds of principalities, duchies, bishoprics, and free cities. Each ruler decided which religion to profess in their territory, according to the principle established by the Peace of Augsburg in 1555. But this fragile compromise rested on the fact that both sides respected each other's rights. Events in Prague showed that the delicate balance had been broken. Emperor Matthias was old and infirm. Real power belonged to his energetic cousin Ferdinand. In August 1619, Matthias died, and Ferdinand became the new emperor. He did not intend to put up with the rebellion. The Bohemian Protestants understood that they could not cope with the might of the Habsburgs alone. They turned for help to the Protestant princes of Germany and neighboring states. The Directorate sent envoys to Transylvania to Prince Gaber Bethlen, who was at odds with the Habsburgs. They sought support in Saxony, Brandenburg, and even in distant England, but most Protestant rulers hesitated. No one wanted to be the first to get involved in an open war with the emperor. The Saxon elector, John George I, although a Lutheran, did not approve of the Calvinists and radicals among the Bohemian rebels. English King James I sympathized with the Protestants, but did not wish to spend money on military intervention. The only one who decided to act was the young Palatine elector, Frederick V. He was only 23 years old. He was a fervent Calvinist and dreamed of glory. When the Bohemian estates offered him the crown instead of Ferdinand, Frederick accepted the offer, despite the warnings of more cautious advisors. The Protestant Union, created in 1608 to protect common interests, was initially unstable. Lutherans and Calvinists argued about dogmas almost as fiercely as they did with Catholics. Lutherans believed in the real presence of the body of Christ in the bread of communion. Calvinists considered this a delusion. For some, Church hierarchy and lush rituals were important, while for others, simplicity and austerity of service were paramount. Lutheran princes did not trust the Calvinist Palatine, seeing him as a source of dangerous radicalism. Saxon Elector John George openly despised Frederick V as an upstart and a heretic among heretics. Already in 1613, after the failure of negotiations at the Reichstag, many princes left the Union. These internal contradictions paralyzed the Protestants at a critical moment. Each prince thought first of all about his own possessions and dynastic interests, not about the common Protestant cause. Frederick's coronation in Prague took place in November 1619. It was an act of direct defiance to the legitimate emperor. Ferdinand II was enraged. He secured the support of Catholic Bavaria, whose Duke, Maximilian I, headed the Catholic League of German Princes. Maximilian was a clever politician and a talented commander. He agreed to help the emperor on the condition that he would be given Frederick's lands and title after the victory. The Spanish Habsburgs also promised military aid. The Pope blessed a crusade against the heretics and allocated significant subsidies. In the spring of 1620, the imperial army under the command of Count Tilly moved on Bohemia. Tilly was a professional soldier. He had participated in wars in the Netherlands, where he learned all the intricacies of modern military art. His soldiers were well-trained and disciplined. The Bohemian army, by contrast, consisted of hastily assembled militia and a small number of mercenaries. Frederick V proved to be an inept commander and an indecisive ruler. He paid more attention to court ceremonies than to preparations for defense. His spouse, Elizabeth, the daughter of the English king, hosted balls and parties while the enemy approached the capital. In the autumn of 1620, imperial troops besieged Prague. On November 8th, the Battle of White Mountain took place near the city, which decided the fate of Bohemia. The battle began at noon. Fog spread over the field. The soldiers could barely distinguish the enemy. The Bohemians took up defensive positions on an elevation. They numbered about 15,000 men. Tilly's Catholic army numbered about 25,000 soldiers. Count Tilly was an experienced tactician. He built his regiments in the classic order: infantry in the center, cavalry on the flanks, artillery in front. The fight began with an artillery cannonade. Cannonballs flew into the dense ranks of the Bohemians, sowing death and panic. Then the Catholic infantry launched an attack. Tilly's mercenaries, hardened in battle, moved in precise columns to the beat of drums. The Bohemian militia wavered. Many of them were holding weapons for the first time. Commanders shouted, trying to keep the men in their positions, but it did not help. When the Bavarian cavalry struck the flank, the Bohemian formation fell apart. A panicked flight began. In 2 hours, the battle was over. The Bohemians lost about 4,000 inches killed and wounded. The Catholics lost only 700 men. Frederick V had not even managed to finish his lunch at Prague Castle when messengers rushed to him with news of the rout. His advisors begged him to flee immediately. Remaining in Prague was deadly dangerous. That same night, the so-called Winter King left the capital with his family and entourage. They barely managed to grab a few chests with jewelry and documents. The Bohemian crown, which Frederick had worn for only a year, remained in the castle. The residents of Prague, upon learning of the king's flight, fell into despair. The next day, Catholic troops entered the city. The reprisal was cruel and methodical. Ferdinand II decided to teach a lesson to everyone who dared to rise up against legitimate authority. On the 21st of June 1621, 27 leaders of the uprising were executed in Old Town Square in Prague. Among them were noblemen, university professors, and wealthy citizens. The execution lasted for several hours. Some were beheaded with a sword, others were hanged or quartered. The bodies of the executed were put on display on the Charles Bridge. The heads of some of the leaders of the rebellion were impaled on pikes and hung on the towers of Prague Castle, where they remained for 10 years as a warning to posterity. But the executions were only the beginning. Ferdinand confiscated the lands of all participants in the uprising. More than half of the noble estates in Bohemia passed into the hands of the emperor and his supporters. Catholic aristocrats from other parts of the empire received Bohemian estates practically for free. A mass re-Catholicization began. Protestant priests were ordered to either accept Catholicism or leave the country. Protestant schools and printing houses were closed. Checkbooks were confiscated and burned. The Jesuits gained control of education. Charles University in Prague, once the center of Hussite scholarship, was placed under the control of the Order of Jesus. Thousands of Protestant families left their native places. Many fled to Saxony, others to Silesia, Hungary, or Poland. Some reached the Netherlands or Sweden. Bohemia lost a significant part of its population. According to various estimates, between a third and half of the inhabitants either died or emigrated in the subsequent years of war and repression. The Czech Protestant culture, which had flourished for more than 2 centuries, was practically destroyed. The German language began to displace Czech in administration and education. Bohemia turned from an independent kingdom into a province of the Habsburg Empire. Frederick V found refuge in The Hague under the protection of the Netherlands. He lost everything, not only the Bohemian crown but also his own Palatine electorate. The emperor transferred the Palatine lands and the electoral title to the Bavarian Duke Maximilian as a reward for faithful service. This violated the traditional balance of power in the Holy Roman Empire and caused discontent even among some Catholic princes. But Ferdinand was adamant. He saw the victory over Bohemia as a sign of divine favor and the beginning of a great cause, the return of all German lands to the bosom of the Catholic Church. The Protestant princes of Germany watched the events with growing anxiety. If the emperor had so easily dealt with Bohemia and the Palatinate, who could guarantee that the same fate would not befall them tomorrow? The Augsburg religious peace formally continued to operate, but events showed that the Catholic side did not intend to observe it. The Protestant Union of German princes proved incapable of organizing an effective defense. Many members, after the defeat of Bohemia, hastened to conclude separate agreements with the emperor, saving their own possessions. The only hope for the Protestants remained outside help. Christian IV, King of Denmark and Norway, Duke of Holstein, was an ambitious and active man. He was 49 years old, had been ruling for more than 20 years, and had managed to turn Denmark into one of the strongest powers in northern Europe. The Danish fleet dominated the Baltic, controlling trade routes between the west and the east. Christian was a Lutheran and saw the strengthening of the Catholic side as a direct threat to his interests. Furthermore, he had personal ambitions for German lands. His son Frederick held episcopal sees in several North German principalities. If the Catholics continued their advance, these holdings would be lost. In 1625, Christian made the decision to intervene in the German conflict. He concluded an alliance with England and the Netherlands, who promised financial support. The Protestant princes of Lower Saxony appealed to him to lead their union and protect them from imperial troops. Christian agreed. In the summer of that same year, he entered northern Germany at the head of an army of 20,000 men. The Danes were good soldiers, but the king did not have enough money to hire more mercenaries. English and Dutch subsidies arrived irregularly and in smaller amounts than promised. Emperor Ferdinand met the new threat decisively. He already had Tilly's proven army, but he understood that mercenaries alone were not enough. At this moment, a man whose name would become a symbol of cruelty and military genius appeared on the scene: Albrecht von Wallenstein. This Bohemian nobleman had made a huge fortune from the confiscation of Protestant lands after the suppression of the Czech uprising. He was a Catholic, but his faith was rather formal. Wallenstein was interested in power, glory, and wealth. He offered the emperor to recruit and maintain an army of 50,000 men at his own expense. Wallenstein's conditions were unusual. He demanded complete freedom of action and the right to maintain his army at the expense of occupied territories. In fact, this meant legalized robbery. The emperor agreed. He had no other choice. By the end of 1625, Wallenstein had assembled a huge army. His regiments consisted of mercenaries of all nationalities: Germans, Italians, Spaniards, Croats, even Scots. Discipline was maintained by fear and regular payment of salary. Wallenstein was an organizer by the grace of God. He created an effective supply system, established intelligence, and a strict hierarchy of command. In the spring of 1626, Wallenstein and Tilly began a joint offensive against the Danes. Christian IV quickly realized that he was facing an opponent of a different level. His army was defeated in several battles. On the 27th of August, 1626, at Lutter, a decisive clash occurred. Tilly, with 17,000 men, attacked the Danish positions. Christian fought bravely. He personally led cavalry charges and was wounded, but his army was routed. The Danes lost more than 6,000 men in killed, wounded, and captured. After Lutter, Wallenstein invaded Mecklenburg and Pomerania, pursuing the remnants of the Danish troops. Cities surrendered one after another. The population of the Baltic lands watched with horror as imperial soldiers looted everything in their path. Wallenstein did not distinguish between friends and foes. His army fed itself through war. Villages were emptied. Citizens paid huge contributions to avoid being pillaged. Wallenstein's officers grew rich. Common soldiers had the opportunity to loot. This system made the army loyal to its commander, but turned the war into an endless nightmare for the civilian population. By 1628, Christian IV was forced out of Germany back to Denmark. Wallenstein laid siege to Danish fortresses in Jutland. The emperor declared him Duke of Mecklenburg and Admiral of the Baltic and North Seas. Wallenstein began to build an imperial fleet to challenge Denmark's dominance at sea. This alarmed not only the Danes but also the Swedes. Sweden closely followed the events in Germany. King Gustavus Adolphus understood that if the Habsburgs consolidated their hold on the southern shore of the Baltic, they would become a direct threat to Swedish interests. In May 1629, a peace treaty between Denmark and the Empire was signed in Lübeck. Christian IV renounced all claims to German lands and pledged not to interfere in the affairs of the Empire. In return, he retained his Danish possessions. This was a complete victory for the Catholic side. Protestant Germany appeared doomed. Tilly and Wallenstein controlled vast territories from the Baltic to the Alps. Ferdinand II was at the peak of his power. In March 1629, even before the signing of the Peace of Lübeck, the emperor issued the Edict of Restitution. This decree required the return to Catholic princes and the clergy of all bishoprics, monastic lands, and other church property that had been secularized and had passed to Protestants after the mid-16th century, following the Peace of Augsburg. This involved dozens of bishoprics and vast areas of land. Many Protestant houses had owned these territories for generations. Now they were ordered to restore the previous state of affairs. Formally, this was a legal act, but in practice, it meant the threat of ruin for a whole series of principalities and inevitable confiscation, which caused fierce resistance even among moderate Lutherans. Magdeburg was one of the largest cities in Germany, a thriving trade center on the Elbe River. Its population was about 35,000 people. The city was Protestant and enjoyed significant autonomy as a free imperial prince-archbishopric. When Ferdinand II issued the Edict of Restitution, the Magdeburgers refused to comply. They expelled the Catholic archbishop and declared their right to self-determination. This was an act of open defiance that the emperor could not leave unpunished. In November 1629, Tilly received an order to besiege Magdeburg. The count was in no hurry. The city was well fortified. The garrison numbered about 3,000 soldiers under the command of an experienced officer, Dietrich von Falkenberg. The citizens fortified the walls, dug trenches, and collected supplies. They believed that help would come. The Swedish king Gustavus Adolphus had already landed in Pomerania and was moving south. The Magdeburgers sent envoys to him with a request for help. Gustav promised to come but hesitated. He was conducting complex negotiations with the Saxon and Brandenburg electors, trying to form an alliance with them. The siege dragged on. The winter of 1629 to 1630 was harsh. Tilly's soldiers froze in the frozen trenches, starved, and fell ill. It was not easy in the city either, but the Magdeburgers held on. In the spring, a real war of attrition began. Tilly blocked all approaches to the city, cutting it off from the outside world. Artillery methodically bombarded the fortifications. The defenders responded with sorties, tried to burn siege engines, and attacked enemy supply trains. Falkenberg was a talented military engineer. He strengthened gaps in the walls, organized counter-battery fire, and maintained the morale of the citizens. But time was working against Magdeburg. Food was running out, and famine began. People ate cats, dogs, and rats. Diseases mowed down the defenders faster than enemy cannons, and help never came. Gustavus Adolphus was tied down by battles with imperial troops in Pomerania. The Saxon elector did not dare to openly stand against the emperor. Brandenburg also wavered. Magdeburg was doomed. On the 10th of May 1631, Tilly's troops launched an assault. By this time, he had been joined by a detachment of Pappenheim and another 8,000 battle-hardened mercenaries. The assault began at dawn. The Catholic soldiers climbed the walls with ladders. Others tried to blow up the gates with petards. The defenders fought desperately. They poured boiling resin, dropped stones, and shot muskets at point-blank range, but they had no strength left. By noon, Pappenheim's mercenaries broke into the city through a breach in the southeastern part of the wall. Falkenberg was mortally wounded while trying to organize the defense in the streets. As soon as the soldiers were inside, a massacre began. The officers lost control of the troops. The mercenaries, embittered by the long siege and hardships, fell upon the defenseless residents. What happened in Magdeburg on May 10 and 11 shocked all of Europe. Soldiers looted houses, killed men, raped women, and spared not even children. In churches where thousands of citizens had fled for shelter, they staged massacres. Priests were killed right at the altars. Fires started whether accidentally or intentionally. The fire spread rapidly through the wooden buildings. A strong wind fanned the flames. By evening, the entire city was engulfed in fire. People burned alive in their houses, suffocated from smoke, and perished under collapsing beams. Those who ran out onto the streets fell under the swords of the soldiers. Tilly tried to stop the massacre, but it was too late. The city turned into hell. The fire raged for 3 days. When the fire finally died out, Magdeburg lay in ruins. Out of 35,000 residents, about 5,000 survived. The rest perished by the sword, fire, violence, or despair. Many threw themselves into the Elbe, preferring to drown than to fall into the hands of the rapists. Contemporaries called this massacre the Magdeburg Wedding, in cruel mockery of the horror that had occurred. Catholic propaganda tried to justify what happened, claiming that the citizens themselves had set the city on fire. The Protestant press accused Tilly of organizing a genocide. News of Magdeburg's fate spread throughout Germany in a matter of weeks. Protestant pamphlets and leaflets with chilling details were distributed by the thousands. Artists created engravings depicting the burning city and the massacre of the residents. Preachers in churches spoke of Magdeburg as a modern Sodom, destroyed by Catholic fanaticism. This was a propaganda disaster for the emperor. Even Catholic princes were shocked by the scale of the destruction. The annihilation of one of the largest cities in the empire for religious purposes seemed like madness. For the Protestants, Magdeburg became a symbol. The city that refused to betray its faith was wiped off the face of the earth. The fate of its inhabitants showed what awaited everyone who dared to resist the emperor. Fear and hatred toward the Catholics reached an unprecedented level. The Saxon elector, John George, who had maintained neutrality until then, realized he could not delay any longer. If he did not take one side or the other, his land would face the same fate. The choice was obvious. A strong ally capable of resisting the imperial armies was needed. Such an ally could only be the Swedish king. Gustavus Adolphus was 36 when he landed with his army in Pomerania in the summer of 1630. He had ruled Sweden for 18 years, and during that time, he had turned the Scandinavian kingdom into a military power. His reforms created the most modern army in Europe. The Swedish infantry used a new tactic: thin lines instead of deep columns, which allowed for more effective fire. Musketeers were trained to shoot in volleys on command. Artillery became mobile. Light cannons could move along with the troops and support an attack. Gustavus was not just an administrator but also a brilliant commander. He personally participated in all battles, inspiring the soldiers with his own example. The king was tall, physically strong, and handled weapons perfectly. He spoke several languages, was interested in science, and patronized education. At the same time, Gustavus was deeply religious. He saw his mission not just as the protection of Protestantism but as the fulfillment of a divine will. His soldiers began every day with prayer. Officers were required to monitor the morality of their subordinates. Plundering and violence were severely punished. Gustavus's military genius was evident not only on the battlefield but also in the organization of supplies. After the war with the Moscow Tsardom in 1617, he realized that without a reliable rear, an army was doomed. Gustavus created the first centralized military logistics system in Europe. Throughout the occupied territory of Germany, warehouses for fodder, grain, and ammunition were built. Special supply trains delivered provisions to troops according to a strict schedule. The king assigned a unified caliber of shells to the artillery, which incredibly simplified logistics. The French paid 1 million livres annually for the maintenance of the Swedish army. Dutch entrepreneur Louis de Geer set up the production of modern weapons and cannons in Sweden itself. This well-oiled economic machine allowed the Swedes to fight far from their native shores for years without losing combat effectiveness. The first year, the Swedes acted cautiously. Gustavus consolidated his position in Pomerania, concluded alliances with local princes, and established the army supply chain. Cardinal Richelieu, although a Catholic cardinal, saw the strengthening of the Habsburgs as a direct threat to French interests. He was not yet ready to enter the war openly, but from the beginning of the 30s, he concluded a series of subsidy agreements with Sweden and the Protestants. In January 1631, the Treaty of Bärwalde was signed. France pledged to pay the Swedish king large sums annually, and Sweden took on military operations in Germany. This money allowed Gustavus Adolphus to maintain a large, well-trained army and hire mercenaries without completely exhausting his country's resources. News of the destruction of Magdeburg reached Gustavus in Stettin. The king was shocked and enraged. He publicly vowed to avenge the innocent victims. The Magdeburg tragedy gave him a powerful propaganda trump card. Now his intervention in the German conflict could be presented as a crusade against barbarism. Protestant princes who had previously wavered began to lean toward an alliance with Sweden. In September 1631, John George of Saxony finally signed a treaty with Gustavus. This was a turning point. Saxony was the largest Protestant principality in Germany. The combined Swedish-Saxon army moved south. Tilly hastily gathered troops to repel the new enemy. On the 17th of September 1631, at Breitenfeld near Leipzig, a battle took place that changed the course of the war. Tilly had about 35,000 men. Gustavus and John George had about 42,000. Numerical superiority was on the side of the Allies, but Tilly was a most experienced commander, and his soldiers had fought in many battles. The Swedes, meanwhile, had yet to prove their combat effectiveness against the Emperor's battle-hardened veterans. The battle began at noon. Tilly built his army according to the old Spanish system: powerful infantry tercios in the center, cavalry on the flanks. Gustavus used his new tactic: stretched infantry lines, artillery in front for support, cavalry in groups for maneuvering. The Imperial cuirassiers attacked first. They crashed into the Saxon flank. The Saxons did not withstand the blow and fled. John George himself barely avoided capture, barely escaping from the battlefield. It seemed that victory was Tilly's, but Gustavus reacted instantly. He moved his reserves to the exposed flank and redeployed his artillery. Swedish cannons began to methodically shoot at the Imperial tercios. The dense columns were an excellent target. Cannonballs pierced the ranks through and through. Grapeshot mowed down dozens of soldiers with a single shot. Tilly tried to regroup, but the Swedish infantry had already moved to the attack. Musketeers fired in volleys and reloaded on the move, firing again. Pikemen covered the shooters, preventing the cavalry from breaking through. This was a war of a new type, mobile, based on the coordination of combat arms and firepower. Tilly's old tactics could not stand against it. By evening, the Imperial army was routed. The Catholics lost about 13,000 inches killed, wounded, and captured, along with all their artillery and baggage train. Breitenfeld became a triumph for Gustavus Adolphus. The myth of the invincibility of Catholic armies was dispelled. All of Germany began to talk about the Lion of the North. That was what they called the Swedish king. Protestant princes hastened in droves to conclude an alliance with him. Cities opened their gates to the Swedes. Gustavus moved south, into the very heart of Catholic Germany. He captured Würzburg, then Mainz, a vital fortress on the Rhine. His troops entered the Rhineland, threatening the possessions of the Catholic electors. Frankfurt, Worms, Speyer, one after another. Cities recognized the power of the Swedish king. Emperor Ferdinand was in despair. Tilly, with the remnants of his army, retreated south to Bavaria. Wallenstein had formally resigned a year earlier. His growing power and ambitions alarmed the Catholic princes, who demanded his removal. Now, Ferdinand was forced to turn again to the only commander capable of opposing the Swedes. In December 1631, Wallenstein received the appointment of commander-in-chief of all imperial forces. The conditions were even more favorable than before: complete independence in military matters, the right to appoint officers, and control over occupied territories. Wallenstein became, in fact, an independent ruler with his own army. In a few months, Wallenstein gathered a new army of 50,000 men. His recruiters promised salary, loot, and glory, and soldiers came in droves. Mercenary work became a profitable business. Many professional military men changed masters depending on who paid more. Wallenstein paid well and regularly, for which the soldiers were loyal to him. In the spring of 1000, 632, he moved north to join Tilly and do battle with the Swedes. Gustavus, by this time, had invaded Bavaria, the wealthiest Catholic principality, and the possession of Duke Maximilian. Bavaria had never known war on its own soil. It was a prosperous duchy with rich cities, fertile fields, and a numerous population. Duke Maximilian was one of the main masterminds of the Catholic reaction. His troops had participated in all punitive campaigns against the Protestants. Now, retribution had come to his home. In the spring of 1632, the Swedish army crossed the Bavarian border. Gustavus led about 35,000 soldiers. His plan was simple: crush the Bavarian army, capture the main cities, and force Maximilian to sue for peace. Tilly, with 20,000 men, took up a defensive position near the town of Rain on the Lech River. He fortified the crossing, built redoubts, and placed artillery. The position proved impregnable. The Lech was wide and fast. Forcing it under enemy fire was extremely dangerous. But Gustavus did not intend to launch a frontal attack. On the 15th of April, 1632, the Swedes began a complex operation. Part of the troops demonstratively prepared for an assault on the crossing, distracting Tilly's attention. Meanwhile, pontooniers upstream were building bridges in several places simultaneously. Tilly realized the maneuver too late. The Swedes had already forced the river and attacked his flank. A fierce battle broke out. 73-year-old Tilly personally directed the counterattack, trying to push the Swedes back into the river. In the heat of the battle, he was wounded by a stray cannonball. It shattered his thigh. Tilly fell from his horse. His adjutants grabbed the wounded commander and took him off the battlefield. Without their leader, the Catholic troops wavered and began their retreat. This turned into a panicked flight. The Swedes captured all the artillery, baggage train, and banners. The Bavarian army ceased to exist as an organized force. Tilly died 2 weeks later from his wound and a fever in Ingolstadt. With his death, a whole era passed. The Count was the last representative of the old school of military art, disciplined, religious, and faithful to his sovereign. He was replaced by cynical condottieri like Wallenstein, for whom war was a business rather than a service to an idea. After the breakthrough on the Lech, the road to Munich was open for the Swedes. On the 17th of May, 1632, Gustavus Adolphus entered the capital of Bavaria. Maximilian fled to Austria, leaving his possessions at the mercy of the winner. Gustavus did not destroy Munich. He understood the political game. Excessive cruelty would have turned the Catholic princes against him, whom he hoped to persuade into neutrality. The Swedes occupied the city and stationed a garrison, but they did not plunder the population. The king imposed a contribution on wealthy citizens and the Catholic clergy, but he did not touch the common people. He even visited the main Catholic shrines of Munich, demonstrating respect for another's faith. This was subtle diplomacy. Gustavus wanted to show that he was not fighting against Catholics as such, but against the tyranny of the Habsburgs. While the Swedes were busy with Bavaria, Wallenstein was gathering strength in Bohemia. By the summer of 1632, he had about 60,000 men, the largest army in Europe. Wallenstein was in no hurry to help Maximilian. Instead, he invaded Saxony, an ally of Sweden. This was a cunning move. By capturing Saxony, Wallenstein cut Gustavus off from his bases in Pomerania and forced the Swedish king to leave Bavaria and hurry to the aid of his ally. Elector John George, in a panic, turned to Gustavus for help. The king had no choice. To abandon an ally meant losing the trust of all Protestant princes. In August, Gustavus pulled his army out of Bavaria and moved north at a forced march. The transition was difficult. The hot summer weather persisted, the roads were dusty, and the soldiers languished from the heat and thirst. But the Swedish discipline was iron. The army covered more than 300 kilometers in 3 weeks. Wallenstein, meanwhile, occupied Saxony and besieged Leipzig. He knew perfectly well that Gustavus would come, and he prepared for a decisive battle. Wallenstein chose a position near the village of Lutzen, a few kilometers from Leipzig. The terrain was level, convenient for the actions of large masses of infantry and cavalry. On the 16th of November, 1632, the armies met. Gustavus had about 19,000 men. Wallenstein had about 25,000. Wallenstein took up a defensive position along the road, reinforcing his flanks with ditches and palisades. The morning was foggy, and visibility was poor. Gustavus decided to attack immediately. without waiting for the arrival of the Saxon reserves. It was risky, but the king did not want to give Wallenstein time to fortify even more. At 10 a.m., the Swedish artillery opened fire, and the battle began. The Battle of Lutzen became one of the bloodiest of the entire war. Both sides fought with desperate courage. The fog hindered coordination. The fight broke into a multitude of separate skirmishes. The Swedish infantry pushed the Imperialists step by step, but every meter came at a high price. Wallenstein was wounded in the arm, but he did not leave the battlefield. Gustavus personally led cavalry charges on the right flank. In the heat of the battle, his horse was killed. The king switched to another. Together with a small detachment, he plunged into the enemy ranks, trying to break through Wallenstein's flank. At this moment, a tragedy occurred. Gustavus was separated from his bodyguards in the thick of the fray. He was nearsighted and, in the fog, lost his orientation. Imperial cuirassiers surrounded the king. One of them shot at point-blank range. The bullet hit Gustavus in the arm. The wounded king tried to turn his horse, but received several more shots. One bullet pierced his lung, another his head. Gustavus Adolphus fell from the saddle, dead. His body remained on the battlefield. The Imperialists stripped the corpse and took the jewelry. Only later did the Swedes find and identify the mutilated body of their king. News of Gustavus's death instantly spread across the battlefield. The Swedes were enraged. Under the command of Duke Bernhard of Saxe-Weimar, they rushed into a new attack with such fury that the Imperialists could not withstand it. Wallenstein, wounded and shaken by the stubbornness of his opponent, ordered a retreat. By evening, the Swedes remained masters of the field. Formally, they had won, but the price was horrifying. They lost about 6,000 men in killed and wounded, and, most importantly, their king. The Imperialists lost about 5,000, but Wallenstein saved his army and retreated in order. The death of Gustavus Adolphus was a shock for Protestant Europe. The Lion of the North had perished at the peak of his glory at age 38. His body was transported to Sweden and buried with royal honors. Protestants mourned him as a martyr and a hero. Catholics rejoiced at the deliverance from their most dangerous enemy. But the war did not end. Sweden had no intention of leaving Germany. Chancellor Oxenstierna took command of the Swedish forces. The German Protestant princes continued the fight. France increased funding for the anti-Habsburg coalition. The 30 Years' War entered a new phase. After Lutzen, Wallenstein became, in fact, an independent ruler. His army numbered tens of thousands of soldiers, loyal personally to him. He controlled vast territories in Bohemia, Silesia, and Saxony. Emperor Ferdinand was nominally his suzerain, but he had no real power over the commander. Wallenstein conducted his own policy, concluded truces with enemies without coordination with Vienna, collected taxes, and appointed governors. He dreamed of creating his own principality, perhaps even of the Bohemian crown. His ambitions knew no bounds, but it was precisely these ambitions that ruined Wallenstein. Catholic princes had long hated him. Bavarian Duke Maximilian considered him an upstart and a heretic. Wallenstein treated religion cynically, kept astrologers at his side, and despised church dogmas. The Spanish Habsburgs suspected him of secret negotiations with their enemies, and the Jesuits at the emperor's court constantly intrigued against the commander. In 1633, these intrigues reached a critical point. Wallenstein was indeed conducting secret negotiations with the Saxons and Swedes, trying to conclude a separate peace. His terms were disadvantageous to the emperor. He demanded significant territorial concessions for the Protestants. When information about these negotiations reached Vienna, Ferdinand made a decision. Wallenstein had become too dangerous. In January 1634, the emperor secretly issued a decree removing Wallenstein from the position of commander-in-chief. Moreover, the commander was declared a traitor. All officers of the army were ordered to arrest Wallenstein or kill him if he resisted. Wallenstein learned of the conspiracy and tried to flee. With a small detachment of loyal soldiers, he took refuge in the town of Eger, on the border of Bohemia. He hoped to wait for help from the Swedes or the Saxons, but the help never came. On the 25th of February 1634, a group of officers under the command of the Irishman Walter Butler arrived in Eger. They were sent by the emperor to arrest Wallenstein. The officers invited the commander and his closest associates to a feast. At the table, when everyone was drunk and relaxed, The conspirators drew their weapons. A massacre began. Wallenstein was killed in his bedroom. He did not even have time to reach for his sword. He was 50 years old. The commander's body was transported to Prague and buried without special honors. His huge estates were confiscated, and his family was stripped of all titles and wealth. The death of Wallenstein did not bring the emperor relief. The war continued with renewed fury. The Swedes, under the command of talented commanders Banner and Torstensson, continued operations in Germany. They won several major victories, capturing important cities and fortresses. The Protestant princes, seeing the weakness of the emperor after the elimination of Wallenstein, became active. Bernhard of Saxe-Weimar, one of the best German military leaders, created his own army with French money. He operated in Alsace and Lorraine, threatening Spanish communications. Spain by this time was becoming increasingly bogged down in the war. Philip IV and his chief minister, the Count Duke of Olivares, directed huge resources to support the Austrian Habsburgs. The Spanish tercios, the best infantry in Europe, fought on all fronts, but the treasury was depleting. The war destroyed not only people but also centuries-old economic ties. The Hanseatic League, which had for centuries controlled Baltic trade, was destroyed once and for all. Sweden captured the mouths of the Weser, Oder, and Elbe. Having cut the main trade routes of northern Germany, Holland controlled the Rhine, Lübeck, Bremen, and Hamburg, the last free cities of the once powerful Hansa, which barely survived under the burden of military requisitions. The German lands lost their dominance over the northern seas forever. The Spanish road, the main route for moving troops and silver from Italy to the Netherlands, was cut by the French. The economic map of Europe was being redrawn to the thunder of cannons and the moans of the dying. Silver from American colonies no longer covered the expenses of endless wars. In Spain itself, discontent with taxes and recruitment levies grew. Catalonia and Portugal grumbled against Castilian dominance. The empire on which the sun never set began to crack at the seams. France, meanwhile, was increasingly intervening in the conflict. Cardinal Richelieu was a brilliant strategist. He understood that direct entry into the war was still premature. France was not yet ready for a major clash with the Habsburgs, but funding the enemies of Spain and Austria was reasonable and profitable. French gold flowed like a river into the Swedish and German Protestant treasuries. Richelieu concluded alliances with the Dutch, the Danes, the Savoyards, everyone who was at enmity with the Habsburgs. He even supported the Turkish Sultan, who was pressuring Austria from the east. By 1634, the Protestant coalition controlled a significant part of southern Germany. The Swedes and their German allies held the Upper Palatinate, Swabia, and part of Franconia. Bernhard of Saxe-Weimar besieged the most important imperial fortress, Nördlingen, in Swabia. The capture of the city would open the way to Austria and put the hereditary lands of the Habsburgs under threat. Emperor Ferdinand understood that if Nördlingen fell, the war might be lost. He turned for help to Spain. The Spanish King Philip IV sent a powerful army to the aid of his brother under the command of the Cardinal Infante Ferdinand, the younger son of King Philip III. He was only 25 years old, but he was a talented commander and an energetic administrator. The Spanish army, numbering about 15,000 men, marched through all of Italy, crossed the Alps, and joined the imperial troops in Bavaria. The combined Catholic forces numbered about 33,000 soldiers. The Protestants near Nördlingen had about 25,000. On September 6, 1634, a grand battle took place near Nördlingen. The Protestant troops under the command of Bernhard of Saxe-Weimar and the Swedish Marshal Horn occupied the dominant height, the Albuch Hill. From here, their artillery could bombard the entire Catholic army. The Catholics had to either attack this impregnable position or retreat. Cardinal Infante Ferdinand and his advisors chose to attack. It seemed like madness, but the Spanish tercios were famous for their tenacity. The battle began at dawn on September 5. The Spanish and Imperial infantry climbed the steep slope under fire from the Protestant artillery. Cannonballs and grapeshot mowed down their ranks, but the soldiers continued to climb. They carried ladders for storming the fortifications and dragged light cannons on their backs. By noon, several attacks had been repelled with huge losses. It seemed the Protestants would win the battle, but the Catholics did not retreat. Wave after wave, they threw themselves at the hill. By evening, the defenders began to wear out. Ammunition was running out, and the men were exhausted by the continuous fighting. At dawn on September 6, the Catholics launched their final, decisive assault. The Spanish tercios broke through the fortifications on the eastern slope. Hand-to-hand fighting ensued. Soldiers slashed at each other with swords and pikes among the guns and wagons. The Swedes fought desperately but were broken by the numerical superiority and fury of the enemy. By noon, the Albuck Hill was taken. The Protestant army began a retreat that quickly turned into a disorderly flight. The Catholic cavalry pursued the fleeing soldiers, hacking down the stragglers and the wounded. The rout was total. The Protestants lost about 12,000 killed and 8,000 captured. All their artillery, baggage train, and banners fell into the hands of the victors. Marshal Horn was captured and spent the next 10 years in captivity. Bernhard of Saxe-Weimar with difficulty led away the remnants of the army, about 4,000 men. The Nördling and catastrophe became the largest defeat for the Protestants since the Battle of White Mountain. All of southern Germany was once again under Catholic control. The Swedes were pushed back to the north. It seemed the Habsburgs were close to a final victory, but this victory had unexpected consequences. The Protestant princes of Germany, seeing that the Swedes could not protect them, began to seek a compromise with the emperor. In May 1635, the Peace of Prague was signed between the emperor and most of the Protestant princes, including Saxony and Brandenburg. The Peace of Prague became a forced compromise. Ferdinand II agreed, in fact, to freeze the implementation of the Edict of Restitution, tying church possessions to their status as of the end of the 1620s, and the Protestant princes pledged to recognize his supreme authority and no longer support the Swedes. It seemed that the religious conflict within the empire could be extinguished, but it was at this very moment that the external front expanded. In that same year, 1635, France, which had until then been fighting against the Habsburgs with the hands and money of others, openly entered the war. Paris declared war on Spain and effectively found itself in a state of armed conflict with the Austrian branch of the Habsburgs as well. The religious 30 Years' War finally turned into a great all-European struggle for hegemony, where Catholic France fought against Catholic Spain and the emperor, no longer for the sake of faith, but for the sake of the redistribution of power on the continent. The Peace of Prague could have been the end of the war, but one player did not desire reconciliation: France. Richelieu understood that the strengthening of the Habsburgs was mortally dangerous for French interests. If the emperor reached an agreement with the German princes and broke the Swedes, the next target would be France. The cardinal decided that the moment for direct intervention had arrived. In May 1635, a few days after the signing of the Peace of Prague, France officially declared war on Spain. The religious war turned into a large European war for hegemony. France did not enter the war for religious motives. Cardinal Richelieu was governed by a cold calculation of national interest. The Habsburgs surrounded French lands on three sides. Spain owned lands in the south. The Spanish Netherlands threatened from the north. The Holy Roman Empire pressed from the east. The French economy needed expansion. Alsace opened the way to the Rhine and rich German markets. The southern Netherlands, with their prosperous cities of Antwerp and Brussels, were a tasty morsel. Northern Italy was the key to Mediterranean trade and influence over the papal throne. Richelieu played a great game where religion served only as a convenient cover for dynastic ambitions and economic expansion. The Catholic cardinal unhesitatingly allied himself with Protestants, and even the Turkish Sultan, for the sake of weakening his rivals. Louis XIII was a weak and sickly king, but his first minister, Cardinal Richelieu, was one of the greatest statesmen in Europe. He ruled France with an iron hand, suppressed internal opposition, strengthened royal power, and built a modern army and navy. Richelieu was a Catholic cardinal, but his policy was determined not by religion but by the interests of the French state. He unhesitatingly supported Protestants against the Catholic Habsburgs and allied with Turks against Christian Austria. His motto was simple: everything for the greatness of France. France's entry into the war changed its entire character. It was no longer a confrontation between Catholics and Protestants. Now, the largest Catholic power on the continent was at war against another Catholic power. Spain was in a vice. From the north, it was attacked by the French and the Dutch. From the south, it was threatened by Turks and Berber pirates. Inside, dissatisfaction grew in Catalonia and Portugal. French troops invaded the Spanish Netherlands, Alsace, and northern Italy. Fierce fighting began on all fronts. The first years of French intervention were unsuccessful. The French army, despite the reforms, was inferior to the seasoned Spanish tercios in field battles. In 1636, the Spaniards invaded France through Picardy and reached almost to Paris. Panic broke out in the capital. Richelieu frantically gathered troops for defense. Louis XIII personally led the army and set out to meet the enemy. The Spaniards, having stretched their lines of communication and fearing encirclement, retreated. Paris was saved, but the threat remained real. In Germany, the war continued with varying success. The Swedes received new subsidies from France and renewed their offensive. Under the command of Bonner, they won several victories over imperial troops in Saxony and Brandenburg. The imperial army, under the command of Gallus, tried to push the Swedes out but suffered failures. The war turned into an endless series of sieges, raids, and minor skirmishes. Neither side could achieve a decisive advantage. Germany bled to death. Cities lay in ruins, and fields were abandoned. The population died out from hunger and diseases. The character of the war changed. In the first years, armies consisted of relatively disciplined soldiers who fought for salaries and ideals. Now, however, the war fed itself. Soldiers did not receive money for months and looted the population to survive. Officers grew rich on contributions and requisitions. Entire regions were devastated. Villages were burned to the ground. Inhabitants were killed or driven into slavery. Peasants fled to the forests, where they formed partisan detachments and attacked the supply trains of both sides. In some areas, up to half of the population perished. The economy of war turned into an independent system with its own laws. Wallenstein, back in the 1620s, created a model where the army fed itself through methodically organized robbery. Officers became military entrepreneurs. They received from the commander-in-chief the right to tax the population and kept a solid part of what was collected for themselves. Every colonel knew how much money he had to collect, how much grain, how much fodder. Soldiers looted villages not chaotically, but according to a clear quota. Every regiment had an assigned territory for systematic requisitions. Peasants paid twice, 3 times to Catholics, to Protestants, to Swedes, to the imperialists. This was a parasitic economy that devoured the country from within, but was surprisingly effective for those at the top of the military pyramid. Colonels grew rich, generals bought up confiscated estates, while the common people died out. The memoirs of contemporaries are full of horrifying descriptions. A peasant woman from Swabia told how soldiers burst into her village, killed her husband and children, raped her, took all the livestock and food, and then burned the house. A priest from Württemberg described how his parishioners ate tree bark and the carcasses of fallen animals, so as not to die of hunger. A chronicler from Magdeburg, which had recovered after the destruction of 1,631, wrote about wolves that roamed the streets and ate the unburied bodies. Epidemics mowed people down by the thousands. Typhus, dysentery, and the plague spread with incredible speed among the population weakened by hunger. Soldiers of both armies fell ill just as much as the civilians. Military hospitals were overcrowded. Medicines were in short supply. Many wounded died not from their wounds but from infection and gangrene. According to some estimates, more people died from disease than from direct military action. Germany turned into one huge burial ground. In 1637, Emperor Ferdinand II died. He was 58 years old. For nearly 20 of them, he had ruled the empire. He had started the war to eradicate Protestant heresy and strengthen the power of the Habsburgs. Now, on his deathbed, he saw that his cause had failed. Germany was destroyed. The Protestants were unbroken. France had entered the war on the side of his enemies. His son, Ferdinand III, inherited an empire torn by contradictions and exhausted by war. The young emperor understood that continuing the war to a victorious end was impossible. Peace was needed. But how to achieve it when all sides demanded incompatible conditions? The Swedes demanded territorial acquisitions in Pomerania and monetary compensation for their participation in the war. The French wanted to annex Alsace and destroy Spanish dominance in the Netherlands. The Protestant princes insisted on guarantees of religious freedom and the return of confiscated lands. The Catholics demanded the restoration of church holdings in accordance with the Edict of Restitution. Spain refused to recognize the independence of the Netherlands. Each side saw concessions as a betrayal of its interests and principles. The war continued. By the early 1640s, all warring parties were exhausted. Spain was on the verge of financial collapse. The Silver Fleet from America was attacked by Dutch and French privateers. In 1640, Catalonia and Portugal rebelled simultaneously. Spanish troops were bogged down in suppressing these uprisings and could not act effectively against external enemies. The Count Duke of Olivares, who had pursued an aggressive policy, was sent into retirement. The new government sought paths to peace. France also suffered from the war. Huge taxes to finance military operations triggered uprisings. In 1639, peasant riots flared up in Normandy. The army brutally suppressed them, but discontent grew. In 1642, Richelieu died. A few months later, King Louis XIII also passed away. A 5-year-old Louis XIV took the throne. The regent was his mother, Anne of Austria, and the de facto ruler was the new first minister, Cardinal Mazarin. Mazarin continued Richelieu's policy, but internal problems limited his options. Sweden was close to bankruptcy. French subsidies did not cover the costs of maintaining the army in Germany. The population grumbled against the endless recruitment levies. Queen Christina, daughter of Gustavus Adolphus, ruled under the guidance of Chancellor Oxenstierna, but her power was shaky. The Swedish army in Germany lived off looting, but even that was no longer helping. There was nothing left to loot. Soldiers deserted. Officers demanded the payment of withheld salaries. The empire was hanging by a thread from collapse. Emperor Ferdinand III desperately sought peace. The treasury was empty, the army was demoralized, and allies were unreliable. The Bavarian Duke Maximilian conducted secret negotiations with the French, ready to betray the emperor to save his possessions. Spain could no longer provide effective help. In May 1643, the French army under the command of Condé crushed the Spaniards at Rocroi. This was a symbolic defeat. The invincible Spanish tercios were destroyed. The myth of Spanish military superiority collapsed. In 1641, peace negotiations began. They took place in 2 Westphalian cities, Münster and Osnabrück. Catholics conducted negotiations in Münster with the French, while Protestants met in Osnabrück with the Swedes. The process was painfully slow. Each side put forward maximalist demands, refusing to make concessions. Envoys spent months arguing about procedural issues. The Swedes demanded monetary compensation of 5 million thalers. The French wanted all of Alsace. The Protestant princes insisted on full religious freedom. While the diplomats argued, the war continued. In 1645, the Swedish army under the command of Torstensson invaded Bohemia and threatened Vienna. The emperor, in a panic, threw his last reserves into the defense of the capital. The French captured a significant part of Alsace and Lorraine. Spain suffered another major defeat at Lens. By 1648, the Dutch had strengthened their independence and controlled the majority of maritime trade. Portugal, with the support of England and France, defended its independence from Spain. By 1648, it became clear that the war had reached a stalemate. No side could achieve a final victory. The continuation of the conflict threatened the complete destruction of Germany as a political unit. The population of some regions had decreased by 70%. Cities lay in ruins, trade had frozen, and entire districts were depopulated. Contemporaries wrote that it was easier to name the places where the war had not passed than to list the destroyed regions. Even the most fanatical proponents of fighting to victory admitted peace was needed at any price. In January 1649, the negotiations finally shifted from the dead point. France and Sweden agreed to lower their demands. The emperor made concessions on the religious question. The Protestant and Catholic princes found a compromise on church lands. Spain recognized the independence of the Netherlands. The Swiss Confederation received official recognition of its independence from the empire. Dozens of minor territorial disputes were settled. On the 24th of October 1648, the peace treaty between the emperor and France was signed in Münster. On the same day in Osnabrück, the treaty between the emperor and Sweden was signed. The Peace of Westphalia established a new order in Europe. Sweden received western Pomerania and control over the mouths of the most important rivers of northern Germany. France annexed most of Alsace and strengthened its positions in Lorraine. The Netherlands and Switzerland received international recognition of their independence. Protestants and Catholics were equalized in rights. Calvinism, along with Lutheranism and Catholicism, became an officially recognized confession. Princes were granted the right to choose the religion of their subjects, but had to be tolerant toward those of a different faith. The Peace of Westphalia redrew not only the political but also the economic map of the continent. Sweden received control over the mouths of the Oder, Elbe, and Weser, the main trade arteries of Germany, and became the undisputed master of Baltic trade for an entire century. France seized Alsace and gained long-awaited access to the Rhine, the greatest trade river of Europe. Germany lost what made it rich: trade routes, industrial centers, and access to the seas. Its cities, which had once rivaled those of Italy and Flanders in wealth, turned into scorched ruins. The population had decreased by a third, and in some areas by two-thirds. The restoration of the economy took almost a century. Holland strengthened its trade hegemony at sea. England strengthened its colonial positions while the continent bled to death. Spain finally slid into decline, having lost both economic and military primacy. The new European order was built not on the religious principles of the Middle Ages, but on a cold calculation of national interests, balance of power, and economic gain. An era of realpolitik was dawning. Most importantly, the Peace of Westphalia destroyed the unity of the Holy Roman Empire. The princes received de facto sovereignty in their domains. The emperor retained his title but lost real power. Each principality could conduct its own foreign policy, conclude alliances, and maintain an army. Germany turned into a conglomerate of 300 independent states, united only nominally. This weakening of Germany was beneficial for France, which for many decades became the dominant force on the continent. Spain continued the war with France even after the Peace of Westphalia, without the support of the empire. This protracted conflict, known as the Franco-Spanish War of 1635-1659, began as part of the Great Knot of the 30 Years' War, and then turned into a separate confrontation between the two powers. The Treaty of the Pyrenees in 1659 consolidated the decline of Spanish power and the final rise of France as the leading force of Western Europe. The 30 Years' War claimed the lives of between 4 and 8 million people. The exact figures are unknown, but it was one of the bloodiest wars in European history until the 20th century. Some regions of Germany lost up to 70% of their population. Württemberg, for example, where 450,000 people lived before the war, numbered only 120,000 at the end of the conflict. Bohemia lost about half of its inhabitants. Mecklenburg was 65% depopulated. Brandenburg, the future core of Prussia, lay in ruins. The economic consequences were catastrophic. Trade routes were destroyed, workshops closed, and fields abandoned. Germany, which before the war was one of the wealthiest regions of Europe, rolled back centuries in its development. The recovery took almost 100 years. Cultural losses were impossible to assess. Thousands of libraries were burned, priceless works of art destroyed, and monuments of architecture ruined. A whole generation grew up in conditions of continuous violence and knew nothing but war. The psychological consequences were no less grave. People lost faith in reason and humanity. What had begun as a religious conflict for the truth and the salvation of souls turned into a senseless slaughter where no one remembered what they were fighting for. Soldiers butchered civilians not out of religious hatred but for the sake of loot. Commanders continued the war not for the sake of ideals but for power and wealth. Common people endured such horror that religious arguments seemed to them like empty sound. The important thing was to survive, to feed the family, to keep a roof over their heads. The 30 Years' War taught Europe a cruel lesson. Religious fanaticism, taken to the extreme, leads to a global catastrophe. Not a single side achieved its goals. The Catholics did not eradicate Protestantism. The Protestants did not break the power of the Habsburgs. Germany was destroyed, and millions perished. And all this in the name of ideas that could have been reconciled at the negotiating table. The Peace of Westphalia established the principle of religious tolerance not out of humanity, but out of fear of repeating the nightmare. Rulers understood that it was better to tolerate dissidents than to destroy their own countries in religious wars. But the memory of the 30 Years' War did not disappear. German peasants for centuries told their children scary stories about Swedish and Croatian horsemen who looted their villages. Preachers cited the war as an example of divine punishment for sins. Historians studied it as the greatest tragedy of the early modern period. And when in the 20th century Europe was again plunged into the abyss of world wars, many recalled the 30 Years' War as a warning of what fanaticism and intolerance lead to. History repeated itself. But on an even more terrifying scale, the lessons of the past were forgotten, and humanity had to learn again from its own mistakes.